There's a story simmering in every man you pass on the street, if you only knew how to listen. A story about burdens carried, about dreams tucked away like old receipts in a wallet, forgotten but not gone. About the kind of strength that ain't about muscles or loud talk, but about just showing up, day after day, even when the world feels like it's trying its damnedest to flatten you. Sometimes a man can go his whole life believing he's just a cog in a machine, just another set of hands on a line, never realizing there's a whole engine in him, waiting for the right spark or maybe the right breakdown to rumble to life. It's funny the way life works. You think you know what you're made of, you build up these walls around who you think you are, and then one day something cracks. And in that crack, turns out there was a whole new path. A path you never saw coming because you were too busy looking down. Take Travis, for instance. 46 years old, going on 100 if you only looked at the lines etched around his eyes. He wasn't the kind of man you'd pick out of a crowd, not for being flashy, not for being loud, not for anything but maybe the sheer, unyielding presence he had. Travis worked at the old industrial park, down by the river where the air always smelled of ozone and something vaguely metallic, a scent that clung to his clothes and hair even after a hot shower. He was a factory man, plain and simple, had been since he was 18, since the day he walked out of high school with a diploma and walked straight into the hum and clang of the assembly line. His face was a testament to 46 years of sun and fluorescent lights, of quiet concentration and the occasional grimace when a wrench slipped or a bolt seized. It was a face that held a certain weariness, yes, but also a deep-seated dependability, like an old oak tree that's seen a few storms. His hair, once a thick brown, was now a salt and pepper mix, cut short and practical, just like everything else about him. He had shoulders that were broad, the kind that naturally sloped forward a little from years of leaning over workbenches, of lifting and pushing and pulling. And his hands, those were the real story. They were big, Travis's hands, not delicate in the slightest. The knuckles were a bit swollen, scarred here and there with faint white lines from long-forgotten nicks and burns. The skin was rough, calloused over decades of gripping tools, of feeling the cold steel of machines, of wiping grease from his brow. They were working man's hands, plain and simple, hands that knew the language of torque and friction, of what it felt like to earn every dollar. He moved with a quiet efficiency, a practiced rhythm honed by thousands of identical tasks. He didn't hurry, didn't dawdle, just moved. His gaze, usually directed at the task in front of him, was intense, focused. But when he did look up, those deep-set eyes, a murky blue, held an unspoken depth. They were often tired, sure, the kind of tired that sleep only partially fixes, the kind that comes from the constant hum of life's responsibilities, but they were also observant, missing little. He was a man of few words, Travis was. He'd nod more than he'd speak, offer a grunt instead of a full sentence, but when he did open his mouth, people listened, not because he was loud, but because his words, sparse as they were, always carried weight. He preferred to watch, to absorb, to process, rather than to lead a conversation. Most folks figured him for stoic, unflappable, a rock, and Travis, well, Travis did his best to live up to that. He kept his head down, he did his work, and he made damn sure nobody ever saw the cracks he felt inside. He was a good man, Travis, a good worker, the kind of man you could set your watch by, and that he thought was enough, or at least it had to be. The world for Travis started long before the sun even thought about making an appearance. His alarm, a tinny, insistent buzz, cut through the quiet dark of 5 a.m. every single weekday. It was a familiar sound, almost a part of him now, like the ache in his lower back or the faint smell of machine oil that clung to his work clothes even after a wash. He'd swing his legs out of bed, the old springs groaning a complaint of their own, and stand for a moment in the chill of the morning, just feeling the quiet, watching the dim outline of Sarah sleeping beside him. She was a good woman, Sarah, understood without needing words, carried her own silent burdens with grace. He'd brush his teeth, shave in the dim bathroom light, careful not to wake Mark or Emily, their soft snores a comforting rhythm from down the hall. Breakfast was quick black coffee strong enough to strip paint and a piece of toast, eaten alone at the small, worn kitchen table. He'd check the calendar tacked to the fridge, a silent reminder of upcoming appointments, school events, bills due. Always bills. The water heater had been making a funny noise. Emily needed new shoes for gym, and Mark was hinting at a used car for when he turned 18 next year. Each item on that mental list was another anchor, another reason to keep his head down and churn. The drive to the factory was short, a familiar blur of faded brick buildings and empty storefronts in their dying industrial town. He'd punch in, the digital clock a stark, unforgiving counter, and step onto the concrete floor that hummed with the dormant power of massive machines. Then came the noise. The grinding, the clanking, the hiss of hydraulics, a symphony of industry that had been the backdrop of his life for 25 years. He worked on the assembly line, a master of his station, repeating the same precise movements thousands of times a day. Loading, pressing, checking. Loading, pressing, checking. It was a physical grind, sure, but the monotony was the real killer, the slow, steady erosion of anything that felt like purpose beyond the next piece. Lunch was a bagged sandwich, eaten in the break room, usually in silence, listening to the younger guys talk about sports or whatever fleeting thing was on their phones. Travis just ate, watched the clock, and thought about the second half of the shift. And then the drive home, and then maybe, if he wasn't too beat, fixing that loose fence post in the yard. His house, a modest ranch-style place, was well-maintained, a testament to his ingrained work ethic, but it showed its age, just like him. It was home, though. It was where Sarah was, where the kids were, and that was everything. But even then, the shadow of the bills, the constant struggle to keep ahead, never quite lifted. It was a tightrope walk every single month, and he was the one who had to hold the balance. He was a good man, Travis, a solid provider. Everyone said so. But deep down, tucked away behind the stoic facade, was a man wrestling with ghosts. The quiet compassion he felt, the flashes of insight he sometimes had, the desire to contribute something more than just his hands, those were things he'd long ago learned to bury. Leaders, he figured, weren't supposed to feel that stuff. Leaders were supposed to be strong, decisive, infallible. They were supposed to know all the answers, to stride in with solutions already formed. And Travis didn't have all the answers. He barely had any of the answers when it came to the bigger picture, the why and the how of the whole damned operation. That was his unspoken fear, the cold knot in his gut, the fear of failure. Not just failing at a task, but failing at life, at being the man he felt he was supposed to be. He'd seen plenty of managers come and go, barking orders, puffing out their chests, and he'd always thought, "That ain't me. I can't do that." His flaw, the one he guarded like a secret shame, was his stubborn reluctance to ask for help, to admit when he was in over his head. To him, that was the ultimate weakness, a crack in the armor that would erode any respect he'd painstakingly earned. It would prove he wasn't leader material, that his imperfections were too glaring to ever be trusted with anything more than the next widget on the line. There were times, usually late at night when the house was silent, that he'd remember old dreams, half-formed thoughts of maybe going to night school, of trying something different, something that used his head as much as his hands. But those were just whispers in the dark, quickly silenced by the weight of responsibility, by the knowledge that quitting a steady job, even a soul-numbing one, wasn't an option. Not with Sarah, Mark, and Emily counting on him. So he kept those dreams buried, kept his compassion locked down, and kept himself apart, a solitary figure in a noisy world, always observing, always doing, always pretending the quiet man was all there was. It was a heavy pretense, though, and sometimes he wondered how much longer he could carry it. The alarm clock, a cheap plastic box with glowing green numbers, shrieked its daily declaration at 5:00 a.m. Travis didn't so much wake as he simply surfaced. His eyes, already weary from the day before, blinked open to the familiar shadows of his bedroom. Sarah usually stirred beside him, a soft groan escaping her lips before she drifted back into a lighter sleep. He envied her those extra minutes, but his internal clock, honed by decades of factory whistles and the relentless demand of bills, wouldn't allow it. He moved quietly through the old ranch-style house, a silent ghost in his own home. The floorboards creaked in predictable spots, just outside Mark's door on the third step down into the kitchen. He knew every sound, every draft, every settling groan of the house. It was his anchor, his responsibility. In the kitchen, he poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee from the pot Sarah had set on a timer, its bitter aroma a comforting start. Toast, usually, while he stared out the window at the still dark street. His modest yard, small but tidy, sat under the glow of a lone street lamp, waiting for the sun to drag itself over the horizon. He'd meticulously mowed that grass, trimmed those hedges, proof that even if the world outside was crumbling, his small corner of it would remain orderly. Soon, he'd hear Mark's heavy footsteps, followed by the clatter of a bowl as his son poured cereal. Emily would appear next, usually grumpy, hair a wild tangle, but always with a quick, mumbled, "Morning, Dad." He'd nod, maybe a grunt in return, reserving his words for when they truly mattered, or so he told himself. Then it was the dash out the door, dropping the kids off on his way to the plant, the quiet hum of his old truck a familiar companion on the empty roads. The factory floor was a world of its own, a sprawling metal beast that demanded constant feeding. The moment Travis walked through the wide double doors, the scent of hot metal, stale oil, and something vaguely acrid hit him. It was the smell of industry, of hard work, of men making things. The constant, thrumming symphony of machinery was a second heartbeat to him, a rhythm he knew intimately. His station, a section of the assembly line that dealt with heavy component fitting, was where he spent the next 8, sometimes 10 hours. Day in, day out, it was the same ballet of repetition: lift, align, bolt, check. The work was physically demanding, the kind that ate at your joints and settled into your lower back, but he'd built a silent pride in his efficiency, in the sheer consistency of his output. No one matched his speed and accuracy, not without sacrificing quality. Every turn of the wrench, every perfectly stacked pallet, translated directly into the grocery bill, the electric meter, the worn tires on Sarah's old sedan that needed replacing again. It was the leaky faucet in the bathroom, the increasingly loud groan from the ancient furnace, the school trip Emily had her heart set on. And Mark was already looking at colleges, dreaming big dreams, and Travis felt the tightening in his chest. A good education didn't come cheap, and Travis, who hadn't gone past high school, knew its value. He carried the weight of those expenses, those expectations, strapped to his back, silently, fiercely. Yet as the years piled on, so did the gnawing unease. Sometimes, as he bolted a particularly complex fitting into place, his hands moving with practiced precision, his mind would drift. He'd watch Mark sometimes, bent over a textbook, eyes bright with curiosity, and a pang would hit him. A flash of what could have been. He'd always been good with his hands, yes, but he'd also been good at solving puzzles, at seeing patterns others missed. A quiet yearning for something more than just keeping things running flickered within him. He wasn't sure what it was exactly, but it felt like a part of himself had been left behind, gathering dust in some forgotten corner. He was a good man, he knew that. Reliable, steadfast. But was reliable all there was? He saw the engineers in their clean shirts, drawing up plans in glass offices, the salesmen in their suits, talking big deals, shaping the future of the company. Men who used their minds in a different way, who had a say in things. He kept his head down, focused on his tasks, but a part of him wondered what it felt like to be heard, to make a difference beyond the immediate, tangible output of his hands. That unspoken hope for a more meaningful contribution, it was a quiet rebellion against the monotony, a secret kept even from himself most days. He'd rarely allow his quiet compassion to show, mistaking it for weakness. When a younger worker messed up, or an older one struggled with a new procedure, Travis would feel the urge to step in, to guide, to offer a word of encouragement. But he'd clench his jaw, tell himself it wasn't his place, that leaders were supposed to be strong, decisive, never showing a hint of doubt, never asking for help. He observed the struggles of others, understood them at a deeper level than most, but kept his observations and his quiet empathy locked down tight. This fear of failure, the one that kept him meticulously avoiding responsibility beyond his immediate tasks, was inextricably linked to his internal image of what a leader had to be. He believed leaders were flawless, titans of knowledge and unwavering resolve. His own flaws, his quiet doubts, his moments of not knowing, felt like disqualifiers. He saw himself as inherently not leader material, fearing that if he ever stepped into that role, his imperfections would be exposed, and the respect he'd earned through sheer reliability would crumble. It was a heavy burden, carrying the weight of his family's future, the fear of losing his job, and the crushing expectation of the stoic man he felt he had to be. The quiet man was all there was, he told himself. But the inner silence, the unspoken dreams, and the hidden compassion were growing louder, pressing against the walls he'd built around himself, threatening to crack. The walls Travis had built around himself, those silent fortresses of stoicism and self-reliance, had stood for years. But the foundations, always a little shaky from the weight of unspoken dreams, were about to give way. It happened on a Tuesday late in the afternoon, when the shift was dragging its feet towards the finish line. The factory floor, usually a symphony of rhythmic clanks and hisses, was suddenly pierced by a sound that made every man and woman freeze in their tracks. A raw, metallic shriek that climbed higher and higher, followed by a gut-wrenching crack that vibrated through the concrete under their boots. The main press, an ancient behemoth they called the Widowmaker, for its habit of gobbling up production targets and spitting out overtime, had seized. A plume of acrid, oily smoke billowed from its guts, stinging eyes and noses. The air, already thick with the smell of metal and sweat, now carried a distinct tang of burning electrical components. The usual hum of the factory died, replaced by a sudden, terrifying silence, broken only by the hiss of steam escaping a burst pipe and the growing whispers of panic. Men started shouting, "What the hell was that?" And, "It's gone, isn't it?" Fingers pointed not at the machine but at each other. Blame, a familiar and bitter currency in that place, was already being exchanged. Henderson, the supervisor for their line, was nowhere to be seen, likely hiding in his office or more probably gone home early for his kid's baseball game. No one was in charge. Just a sea of bewildered faces, some pale with fear, others flushed with anger. The Widowmaker, now silent and inert, looked less like a machine and more like a tombstone for their jobs. Travis stood there, his jaw clenched, the familiar tension coiling in his gut. His first instinct, honed over decades, was to melt into the background, to observe, to let someone else handle the inevitable shitstorm. But the chaos, the raw, unadulterated fear he saw in the eyes of his colleagues, men he'd worked alongside for 20 years, was different this time. It wasn't just a bad day, it felt like the end. He saw young Mark, fresh out of trade school, his eyes wide with a terror that spoke of rent and student loans. He saw old Manelli, a month from retirement, his hands trembling as he stared at the broken press. His own fear, deep-seated and constant, suddenly mingled with a different kind of dread, the fear for them, for what this breakdown meant for their families. The silence of the machine was deafening, the panicked murmurs a rising tide. Nobody was stepping up. Nobody was saying anything that wasn't accusation or despair. His hands, calloused and scarred, were clenched so tight his knuckles shone white. He felt a surge of frustration, hot and sharp, not at the broken machine, but at the inertia, the helplessness. And then a voice, raspy and a little shaky, cut through the din. It was his. All right, everybody shut up for a minute." He hadn't planned it. The words had just escaped. All heads snapped towards him. Travis, the quiet man, the stoic observer, he swallowed hard, his throat dry. The weight of all those expectant, desperate eyes was suffocating. His carefully constructed facade of unflappability felt like it was crumbling. He opened his mouth again, and what came out wasn't the strong, decisive, infallible pronouncement he imagined a leader would make. It was something far more raw. "Look," he started, his voice still a little rough. I don't know how to fix this." He paused, watching their faces. No scorn, just surprise. He forced himself to continue, feeling a strange lightness even as the vulnerability hit him like a physical blow. "None of us do, probably, not alone anyway, but we need to figure it out together. And I'm scared. I'm scared we're gonna lose our jobs if we don't." The silence that followed his confession was profound. It wasn't the shocked silence of disapproval, but something deeper. It was the silence of recognition, of shared fear. He watched as the anger in some faces softened into concern, the panic in others subsided into a focused intensity. Old Manelli nodded slowly. Young Mark, who'd been staring at his feet, looked up, a flicker of something new in his eyes. "He's right," someone muttered from the back. Then another voice, stronger this time. "Well, what do we even do first? Who knows about the hydraulic system?" And just like that, the dam broke. Not into a flood of solutions, but into a stream of questions, of tentative suggestions, of men and women finally looking at the problem instead of just at each other in fear. Travis didn't have answers, not then. But in that moment, in the sudden, quiet collaboration, a seed was planted. He just didn't know it yet. All he knew was the surprising, terrifying relief of having spoken his truth, a truth he'd buried so deep for so long. The shift eventually ended, the broken press a silent, monstrous shadow on the factory floor. Travis went home, the usual hum of his old pickup truck a familiar comfort, but the day's events replayed in his mind. He kissed Sarah goodnight, heard the quiet breathing of Mark and Emily from their rooms. The house was a sanctuary of normal, but inside him, a storm was brewing. He found himself awake at 3 a.m. The house was utterly silent, save for the refrigerator's low thrum. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, the numbers on the digital clock glowing an unholy red. 3 o'clock, the witching hour his father used to call it. The hour when all the demons came out to play. Tonight, his own demons were having a field day. He replayed his words at the factory, the admission of fear, of not knowing. The raw honesty that had somehow, impossibly, brought others together. He'd broken his own cardinal rule. Never show weakness. Never admit doubt. And yet it hadn't destroyed him. It had done something else entirely. A cold, hard wave of self-assessment washed over him. What had his life become? A meticulous avoidance of anything beyond his assigned tasks. A quiet, reliable cog in a machine, terrified of stepping out of line, terrified of judgment, terrified of failing. He saw himself, a man of 46, trapped in a cage of his own making, a cage built from the belief that strength meant silence, and leadership meant invulnerability. He thought of the years, the endless shifts, the suppressed urges to offer more, to contribute more meaningfully. The quiet compassion he'd bottled up. The dreams he'd buried under layers of duty and fear. He played the part of the stoic man so well, he'd almost believed it himself. But now, in the unforgiving darkness of 3 a.m., the illusion was shattering. He'd always told himself that leaders had to be strong, decisive, never showing weakness. He looked at the Hendersons of the world, men who projected an image of competence, whether it was real or not, and thought, that's what I can't be. He saw his quiet doubts, his moments of uncertainty, as fatal flaws. But today, standing amongst the chaos, his flawed, uncertain words had cut through the panic in a way Henderson's bluster never could have. The fear of failure, the one that had kept him meticulously avoiding responsibility, was still there, sharp and insistent. But now another fear was emerging, colder and more insidious. The fear of living a life unlived, a potential unfulfilled. What if he'd been wrong all along? What if the very things he considered weaknesses were, in fact, the keys to something more? He felt a profound exhaustion, not just physical, but soul-deep. He'd spent decades building walls, and in one honest moment they'd come tumbling down. And as he lay there, raw and exposed in the quiet darkness, he finally allowed himself to feel the crushing weight of regret, the quiet desperation for a different path, for a purpose beyond just showing up and keeping his head down. He didn't know what it meant, or what he would do next, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he couldn't go on like this. The quiet desperation for a different path, for a purpose beyond just showing up and keeping his head down. He didn't know what it meant, or what he would do next, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he couldn't go on like this. It wasn't a thunderclap revelation, not some movie moment where the heavens opened and a new path illuminated itself. It was far quieter, far more fundamental. It was the slow, steady drip of a leaky faucet, finally overflowing its basin. Enough. The word echoed in the silence of his skull, not shouted, but whispered with the weary authority of a man who'd reached his limit. Enough of the pretending. Enough of the hiding. Enough of the fear dictating his every move. When the alarm buzzed at 5 a.m., a sound that usually pulled him from shallow sleep into the familiar drudgery, something felt different. The air in the room was the same, the faint scent of Sarah's shampoo on the pillow beside him, the rumble of the furnace kicking on downstairs. But inside Travis, the gears had shifted. The weight of couldn't go on like this was still heavy, but now it was joined by a new, lighter, yet equally terrifying conviction. I have to try something else. He dressed in his usual work clothes, faded jeans, a blue flannel shirt, but each button, each shoelace tied, felt charged with a silent, momentous decision. He made his coffee, the smell a comforting anchor in the uncertain morning. Sarah stirred when he kissed her forehead, a quiet ritual. He saw the questions in her eyes, the familiar worry etched around them, but he just squeezed her hand. Not yet. He didn't have the words for her, not yet, because he barely had them for himself. The factory loomed under the gray pre-dawn sky, a behemoth of steel and grime. Inside, the lingering tension from yesterday's breakdown was palpable, thick as the dust motes dancing in the fluorescent lights. Blaming wasn't overt, but it hung in the air, a low hum beneath the grind of resumed production. The broken machine, the one that had stopped everything, was still cordoned off, a silent monument to their collective helplessness. Henderson was back, barking orders, trying to reassert control, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. The repair crew was expected later, but the fear of lost hours, of lost contracts, was a poison in the air. Travis walked past his usual station, heading for the break room, coffee cup in hand. He felt the familiar pull to just put his head down, to do his own job, to wait for someone else to figure it out. It was a comfortable habit, decades in the making. But then he remembered the 3 a.m. silence, the quiet, firm, enough! He stopped. His eyes scanned the floor. A small group of younger guys, Mark among them, were gathered around a piece of related equipment, looking lost, muttering to each other. Their faces were grim. Henderson had just walked past them, throwing a dismissive, "Figure it out, we're behind," over his shoulder. It was the old way, the way that made men feel small, isolated. Travis felt his stomach clench. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to keep walking, to mind his own business. What could he say? He wasn't the supervisor. He didn't have the solution for the bigger breakdown, let alone this smaller, related issue. He felt the familiar shame of not knowing, of not being the guy with all the answers. But then another thought, faint but persistent. What if not knowing was exactly what they needed to hear? He took a deep breath, the stale air scratching at his throat. He turned slowly, deliberately, and walked towards them. Each step was heavy, an invisible chain pulling him back, another pushing him forward. He felt exposed, naked under the indifferent factory lights. "Morning, fellas," he said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. The group looked up, startled. Mark nodded, eyes wide with surprise. "Everything all right, Travis?" one of them asked, a hint of suspicion in his tone. Travis rarely initiated conversation. He shoved his hands into his pockets, the coffee cup suddenly heavy. "Not really, is it?" He glanced at the equipment they were staring at, then back at their faces. "Look," he began, the words catching in his throat for a split second. "That main line's still down, and this ain't gonna run right until we figure out why it's backed up." He paused, forcing himself to look each man in the eye. "And truth is, I don't rightly know what the best move is here. I've got some ideas, old ideas, but they might not be right for this." He took another breath, feeling the fear of judgment prickling at his skin. "I'm not sure I've got the answers, but we're all in this together, aren't we? So maybe if we throw everything we've got at it together, we can figure it out faster than just one guy staring at a broken machine." It was an admission. A raw, unvarnished confession of uncertainty from a man who had always prided himself on his quiet competence. It felt like standing in the middle of the factory floor, yelling, "I'm scared and I don't know." But it wasn't yelled. It was said quietly, sincerely, a statement of shared struggle, not personal weakness. And as he finished speaking, he waited, bracing himself for the dismissal, the confusion, the polite nods that meant "Go back to your corner, Travis." He waited. For a moment, the silence stretched, thick and heavy like the humid air before a summer storm. Then one of the younger guys, Jimmy, shifted his weight. "Well, Travis," he said, not unkindly, "you been here longer than any of us. You seen more broken stuff than a junkyard dog. If you ain't got the answers, I don't know who does." But there was no challenge in his voice, just a weary honesty that mirrored Travis's own. Old man Miller, who'd been on the floor since Travis was in diapers, cleared his throat. "He's right, though, ain't he?" he mumbled, rubbing his chin. "We're all staring at it, and it ain't gonna fix itself just 'cause we got a boss somewhere in an office looking at spreadsheets." He looked at Travis, a flicker of something new in his eyes, not respect for authority, but something closer to shared burden. "So what's your old ideas, then? Lay 'em out. Can't hurt to hear 'em, can it?" And just like that, the dam had a hairline crack. It wasn't a flood of solutions, not yet. It was a ripple. Travis felt a strange mix of relief and terror. Relief that they hadn't laughed him out of the room, terror that now he actually had to try. The next few days were a different kind of hard. It wasn't just the physical grind of the factory floor, the sweat and the oil and the relentless noise. It was the mental grind. He spent day 3 walking the line with Miller, talking through schematics Travis hadn't looked at in years, tracing pipes with his calloused finger, listening to Miller's gruff observations. He felt exposed, asking questions, admitting he couldn't recall every detail, taking notes like a rookie. He'd catch glimpses of the other guys watching them, curiosity mixed with a habitual skepticism. Some still hung back, waiting for the real leader to show up and take charge, waiting for Travis to slip up. He felt their eyes, their unspoken doubt, gnawing at the edges of his confidence. He wanted to retreat into his shell, to just grab a wrench and get back to the familiar comfort of solitary, physical work. This talking, this thinking out loud with others, felt like wearing his skin inside out. By day 7, the initial ripple had grown into a hesitant current, but the problems hadn't magically disappeared. They'd tried one of Travis's old ideas. A minor adjustment to a feeder mechanism that had worked on a similar machine years ago. It hadn't done squat. If anything, it made the damn thing grind worse for an hour before they could reverse it. A collective sigh, almost inaudible, went through the team. Travis felt a hot flush crawl up his neck. That old fear of failure, the one he thought he'd just faced down, came roaring back like a furnace blast. "See?" A voice sneered in his head. "You don't know anything. You just made it worse. Go back to your corner, Travis." That night, lying next to Sarah, the dim light from the street lamp cutting across their bedroom, Travis stared at the ceiling. He felt like a damn fool. What had he been thinking? He wasn't cut out for this. He'd just made himself vulnerable, laid bare his uncertainty, and for what? To lead them down a blind alley. He could practically feel the weight of their unspoken disappointment, even if no one had actually said a word. He thought about just letting it all go, shrinking back, letting someone else step up, or letting the chips fall where they may. Just go back to his quiet corner. It would be easier. God, it would be so much easier. The thought was a siren song, a warm blanket of invisibility. But then he remembered Jimmy's weary honesty, Miller's gruff suggestion. He remembered the brief spark in their eyes when he'd admitted he didn't know but needed them. And he remembered Mark's wide eyes at the dinner table and Emily's easy laugh. This wasn't just about him anymore, was it? He'd opened a door, even if it was just a crack. And now, walking back through it felt like a betrayal, not just of them, but of that quiet voice inside him that had screamed, "Enough!" That other night. He was tired, bone-deep tired. But something stubborn, something like the grit he found in the factory dust, refused to let him quit. Wasn't sure what to do next, but he knew he couldn't go back. Not now. The next morning, day 8, Travis was the first one on the floor again. He had dark circles under his eyes, but his jaw was set. He found Miller already there, tinkering half-heartedly with a valve. "Morning, Miller," Travis said, his voice raspy. "That thing we tried yesterday, my bad. Guess that wasn't the answer." He didn't try to explain it away, didn't blame the machine or the parts. "Just owned it," Miller grunted, then surprised Travis by saying, "Happens. Every damn engineer I ever met made 10 mistakes for every one thing that worked. Difference is they usually tried to hide the mistakes." He wiped his hands on a rag. "So what's next, boss?" "Boss," was said with a wry grin, but there was a genuine question in his eyes. Travis took a deep breath. "Next," he said, looking around the cavernous factory, "is we try something else. And then something else after that until we get it right. But this time, I want everyone on it. Every damn idea, no matter how stupid it sounds. We write them down. We talk them through, even if it feels like we're just throwing spaghetti at the wall, because whatever it is that's stopping this line, it's bigger than one man's brain." He wasn't shouting. He was just stating a fact, a hard-earned truth. He felt the fear still, but underneath it, a tiny ember glowed. It wasn't confidence in his own knowing, but confidence in the shared effort. And that felt different. That felt sustainable. It was still a battle every single day against the broken machinery, against the clock, against the lingering doubt in the eyes of some, and against the loudest doubt of all, the one still echoing inside his own skull. But he was showing up, and so were they. That felt sustainable. It was still a battle every single day against the broken machinery, against the clock, against the lingering doubt in the eyes of some, and against the loudest doubt of all, the one still echoing inside his own skull. But he was showing up, and so were they. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to shift. The guys, initially skeptical, started to warm to the idea. A young kid, fresh out of trade school, piped up with a wild theory about a faulty pressure sensor that everyone else had dismissed. Travis, instead of shooting it down like he would have before, just nodded. "All right, let's test it. What do we need?" And they did. It wasn't the problem, not that day, but the act of listening, of giving space, opened a valve. The next day, an old-timer, usually quiet as a church mouse, mumbled something about a similar issue he'd seen 30 years ago in a different plant, involving a subtle hairline crack in a feeder pipe. Everyone looked at Travis. He met their gaze. "Okay, let's trace every damn pipe, find that crack." The air in the factory, once thick with tension and blame, started to lighten. It wasn't a party, no, but the silence wasn't hostile anymore. It was the quiet hum of minds working, hands moving with purpose, and the occasional burst of frustrated but ultimately constructive language. Travis found himself moving differently. His shoulders, usually hunched in silent endurance, seemed to broaden a little. He still worked the line, still got his hands dirty, but now he wasn't just fixing his part. He was orchestrating, asking, guiding. He wasn't yelling orders. He was just present, absorbing the chaos and reflecting back a steady, quiet resolve. The morning the line finally coughed, sputtered, and then started running smoothly, a collective gasp went through the floor. Then a cheer, low and rumbling at first, then swelling. It wasn't a perfect run, not yet, but it was running. Travis stood there, watching the gears turn, the product moving. He felt a sting behind his eyes he hadn't felt in years. He didn't raise his fists in triumph. He just looked at the faces around him, Miller, the young kid, the old-timer, and gave a small, genuine smile. It wasn't his victory. It was theirs. Weeks turned into months. The factory hummed, not without its glitches, but now, when a problem arose, the old panic didn't set in. People looked at Travis, not for an answer, but for a direction, for him to start the conversation. He'd found his voice, not by pretending to be an expert, but by admitting he was just one of them, trying to figure it out. At home, Sarah noticed it first. He was still tired, of course, but the weary line between his brows had softened. He listened more when Mark talked about school, really listened. He laughed louder when Emily told a joke. One evening, as they sat on the porch, he confessed to Sarah, "You know, all my life I thought leaders had to be these big, strong guys who never messed up, had it all figured out." He paused, looking out at the fading light of the industrial town. "Turns out you don't gotta have all the answers to lead. Sometimes just admitting you're in over your head and asking for help, that's what gets people to actually follow you. He looked at her, his eyes surprisingly clear. You stop pretending to be a brick wall and suddenly everyone else pitches in. It's kind of funny, really. He wasn't some polished executive, no. He was still Travis, still a factory man with grease under his fingernails and the subtle ache in his back. But the stoic facade had cracked, and through that crack, something real had shone through. He'd found his true strength not in hiding his weakness, but in sharing it. He learned that the weight of the world wasn't meant to be carried by one man, but by many together.